Welcome to the darkest corners of your imagination, where fear knows no boundaries. This is Mr. Night Scares Story, the home of spine-chilling tales that will haunt your dreams. Here, the night comes alive with stories of unspeakable terror, from cursed forests to haunted houses, from lurking shadows to untold urban legends. We bring you nightmares you'll never wake up from. Are you brave enough to face what lies ahead? Once you enter, there's no turning back. Subscribe now, if you dare. And remember, every story you hear here might just be true. Mr. Night Scares Story, where fear becomes reality. Story number 1. Code Black. The wind howled outside as storm clouds churned over the small town of Hartsville, South Carolina. The rain came down in relentless sheets, pelting the windows of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital with a fury that seemed almost unnatural. Dr. Emily Carter sat at the nurse's station on the 3rd floor, flipping through patient charts and sipping on a cold cup of coffee. It was her 3rd consecutive night shift, and fatigue clung to her like a wet blanket. The hospital was unusually empty, save for a handful of patients in the recovery ward, 2 nurses, and a security guard stationed at the front desk. "Quiet night," Nurse Jenna muttered, leaning against the counter. "Too quiet," Emily replied, smirking weakly. It was always the quiet nights that brought trouble. At precisely 11:47 p.m., the overhead intercom crackled to life. A distorted voice, grainy, like a bad radio transmission, spoke 2 words: "Code Black, room 309. Emily froze, her pen hovering over the chart she'd been annotating. Her eyes flicked to Jenna, who looked equally confused. "Code Black?" Jenna asked, her brow furrowed. "What does that even mean?" Emily shook her head. "It's not one of ours. We have code blues for cardiac arrest, code reds for fires, but I've never heard of a code black." They exchanged uneasy glances. Room 309 was in the ICU wing, which had been closed for renovations weeks ago. The last patient was discharged, the equipment packed away, the doors locked. The intercom crackled again, repeating the announcement. "Code Black, room 309. Emily's stomach churned. Rationality told her it was a glitch in the system, maybe a prank. But the unease crawling up her spine told her otherwise. "Should we check it out?" Jenna asked hesitantly. "We have to," Emily said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. She grabbed a flashlight from the desk and motioned for Jenna to follow. The walk to room 309. The hallway leading to the ICU wing was dimly lit, the storm outside casting flickering shadows through the tall windows. The usual hum of fluorescent lights was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made every footstep echo ominously. As they approached the ICU, the air seemed to grow colder. Emily tightened her grip on the flashlight, her pulse quickening. When they reached room 309, Emily hesitated. The door, which should have been locked, was ajar. Pushing it open with her flashlight, she stepped inside. The room was dark, the faint smell of disinfectant mingling with something fouler, something metallic, like blood. "Emily," Jenna whispered, pointing to the far wall. Emily's flashlight beam landed on a handprint, smeared in dark red across the pale green paint. Her breath hitched. "Is that blood?" Jenna asked, her voice shaking. Emily nodded, her throat dry. "Stay close." The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Jenna screamed, clutching Emily's arm. The flashlight wobbled in Emily's trembling hand, its beam darting around the room. "Who's there?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. At first, it looked like a shadow, tall and impossibly thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it stepped into the faint light of the flashlight, Emily realized it wasn't a shadow at all. Its face was a distorted amalgamation of features. Hollow eyes, a mouth twisted into a permanent scream, and skin that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. "Leave," it hissed, its voice a guttural whisper that made Emily's stomach turn. "Emily, we need to go," Jenna whimpered, pulling at her sleeve. Emily backed toward the door, her eyes locked on the figure. She reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Leave," the figure repeated, its voice growing louder, angrier. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, the figure was gone. The door finally gave way, and Emily and Jenna stumbled into the hallway. They ran, the sound of their panicked footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. Behind them, the intercom crackled again. "Code Black, room 309. Emily skidded to a halt. "It's trying to make us go back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would we go back?" Jenna cried. "We won't get out until we figure this out," Emily said, dread settling deep in her chest. The hallway began to shift. The fluorescent lights dimmed, casting the walls in an unnatural red glow. Doors that once led to patient rooms now opened into black voids, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Emily realized the only place to go was the basement. The hospital's backup power systems were there, and she hoped they could reset the intercom system and stop whatever was happening. The stairwell leading to the basement was damp and cold. Each step creaked ominously beneath their weight. The basement was worse than Emily remembered. Rows of patient beds lined the walls, each one occupied. Pale figures lay motionless under the thin hospital sheets, their faces obscured. But when Emily shone her flashlight on the nearest bed, the figure turned its head to look at her. Its face was gaunt, its eyes hollow. "Help us," it whispered, its voice rasping and weak. Emily stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "These are the patients who died here," she murmured. Jenna grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." Realizing the only way to end the nightmare was to confront it, Emily and Jenna made their way back to room 309. The room was no longer empty. The bed was occupied by a man hooked up to machines that weren't plugged in. His eyes were wide open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The shadowy figure reappeared, looming over the bed. "You let him die," it hissed, its voice echoing in Emily's mind. Emily's breath caught. She recognized the man. It was a patient she'd lost during her first year of residency. A man who had slipped through the cracks during a chaotic night shift. "I didn't mean to," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. The figure leaned closer. "Prove it." Emily recounted everything she had done to save the man, her voice steady despite the fear. As she spoke, the room began to change. The oppressive darkness lifted, and the figure began to dissolve. The intercom crackled one final time. "Code Black resolved." The lights flickered back on, and the hospital returned to normal. Emily later learned that Code Black had been a term used decades ago for catastrophic medical failures at the hospital. The ICU wing had been closed following a tragic incident involving multiple patient deaths. Deaths the hospital had tried to cover up. Though the hospital resumed its normal operations, Emily resigned a month later. But the memories of that night stayed with her, haunting her dreams. And sometimes, late at night, she could still hear the intercom crackling. "Code Black, room 309, story number 2, the last patient." It was nearing midnight at Mercy Pines Hospital, a sprawling facility with a reputation for efficiency and care. Nestled in the heart of the city, it was a place that saw its share of emergencies, miracles, and tragedies. But tonight, something different was stirring in the sterile, whitewashed halls. Dr. Rachel Morgan, a seasoned ER physician, was finishing her 12-hour shift. The storm outside rattled the hospital's windows, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Most of the staff had already gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew to handle the night shift. Rachel stretched her aching shoulders, looking forward to heading home. But as she reached for her coat, the hospital's PA system buzzed to life. "Dr. Morgan to Ward 6C. Dr. Morgan to Ward 6C. Rachel frowned. Ward 6C had been shut down for months due to budget cuts. It was empty, its lights off, and its doors locked. She hesitated, but her sense of duty kicked in. Grabbing her ID badge and phone, she headed for the elevator. The hallway leading to 6C was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting an unsettling glow. When Rachel reached the double doors of the ward, she noticed something odd. The keypad lock that secured the entrance was blinking green. Unlocked. Her heart quickened. She pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit corridor. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, but there was something else too. A faint metallic tang that made her stomach turn. The ward was empty as expected. Rows of patient rooms stood dark and silent. But at the far end of the hall, one room was illuminated. Room 616. Rachel approached cautiously, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The door to room 616 was ajar, and inside, the soft hum of a monitor broke the silence. She pushed the door open and froze. A man lay on the bed, hooked up to machines that beeped rhythmically. His skin was deathly pale, and his eyes were closed. A name tag hung from the end of the bed. John Doe. Rachel's mind raced. There were no patients in this ward, there shouldn't be. She checked the monitor. Heart rate, 45 BPM. Blood pressure, 90/60. Alive but barely. Hello, she called out, her voice trembling. The man's eyes snapped open. His gaze locked onto hers, unblinking and intense. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Rachel stepped closer, leaning down to hear him. "What's your name? How did you get here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chill running down her spine. "Don't," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Don't what?" Rachel pressed. His hand shot up, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes widened in terror. "Don't let them in." Before Rachel could respond, the machines around him began to go haywire. The heart monitor flatlined, and the room was plunged into darkness. Rachel stumbled back, her heart pounding. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in a dim red glow. She turned to leave, but stopped dead in her tracks. Silhouettes stood in the hallway, their forms barely visible in the flickering light. There were 3 of them, tall and motionless. "Who's there?" Rachel called out, her voice echoing. The figures began to move, their steps slow and deliberate. As they drew closer, Rachel realized they weren't human. Their bodies were twisted and unnatural, their limbs too long, their faces featureless. Panic surged through her. She darted out of the room, sprinting down the hall. The hospital was no longer familiar. Hallways twisted and turned, leading her in circles. Doors that should have led to stairwells opened into empty voids, and the elevators were unresponsive. The figures followed, their movements unnaturally fluid. Rachel's lungs burned as she ran, her mind racing for a way out. She ducked into a supply closet, slamming the door shut and pressing her back against it. The sound of their footsteps stopped just outside. She held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. The doorknob rattled. Suddenly, everything went silent. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her like a weight. A voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You can't run from us, Doctor." Rachel felt a cold chill race down her spine. She turned on her phone's flashlight, illuminating the cramped closet. Scrawled across the walls, in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "It's your turn now." Flashes of memory hit Rachel like a tidal wave. Patient screaming in pain. A rushed surgery. A mistake she tried to forget. She had buried the incident, convinced herself it wasn't her fault. But the guilt had festered, and now it had come for her. The door burst open, and the figures loomed over her. Their featureless faces seemed to twist, forming mouths that whispered accusations. "You let us die." Rachel stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to. I tried to save you." The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. The final stand. Summoning all her courage, Rachel screamed, "I'm sorry." The room trembled, and the figures froze. The oppressive darkness lifted slightly, and Rachel felt the weight on her chest ease. The figures dissolved into smoke, their whispers fading into silence. Rachel woke up in the ER, surrounded by her colleagues. They told her she had been found unconscious in the empty ward 6C, clutching a patient chart that didn't exist. No one believed her story, but Rachel knew the truth. The hospital held its secrets, and some mistakes could never be left behind. Story number 3. The Silent Ward. The Mercy Hill General Hospital had a reputation for its state-of-the-art facilities and compassionate care. But no one talked about the West Wing. It had been closed for over a decade after a mysterious fire swept through Ward 13, killing 10 patients and a nurse. The fire was blamed on faulty wiring, but rumors persisted, whispers of strange sightings and disembodied voices. Dr. Laura Bennett, a new hire on the night shift, didn't believe in ghost stories. As a pragmatic physician, she chalked such tales up to superstition. But she'd never worked a shift near the West Wing until now. It was 11:30 p.m. when Laura noticed the first oddity. The monitors at the nurse's station began to flicker. A patient's chart she had just placed on the desk was suddenly on the floor. Wind, she muttered to herself, though the hospital windows were sealed tight. Then came the elevator. The ding of its arrival made Laura glance up, but no one stepped out. She walked over, peering into the empty car. The button for the West Wing was glowing. She frowned. The West Wing was sealed off, its doors bolted shut. No one had been inside since the fire. The elevator doors slid shut, and the car began moving on its own, heading for the forbidden floor. Laura tried to shake off her unease, but as she returned to her rounds, the hospital intercom crackled to life. Code red, Ward 13. Her heart stopped. Ward 13 didn't exist anymore. The fire had destroyed it, and it had never been rebuilt. The intercom crackled again, repeating the announcement. Nurse Karen, an older woman with decades of experience, looked up from her charting. Her face had gone pale. "That has to be a mistake," she whispered. "It's not possible." Laura forced a smile. "It's probably just a glitch in the system." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. At 12:15 a.m., the power went out in the main building. Emergency lights flickered on, casting the halls in an eerie red glow. Laura grabbed a flashlight and her phone. She was heading to the maintenance room to check the generator when she noticed something strange. The heavy steel doors to the West Wing, which were always locked, now stood wide open. She stopped in her tracks, staring at the darkened corridor beyond. Cold air wafted out, carrying with it the faint smell of burnt wood and something metallic. Blood. "Don't," Karen's voice came from behind her, trembling. "No one goes in there." But then Laura heard it. A faint voice, calling her name. The walk down the hall. "Hello," Laura called, stepping cautiously into the West Wing. The air was colder here, and the silence was oppressive. Her flashlight beam revealed peeling paint and broken tiles. Wheelchairs and gurneys were scattered haphazardly, left behind in the rush to evacuate during the fire. The voice called again, soft and urgent. "Dr. Bennett, help me." It came from room 1307, the last room on the left. The door to room 1307 was ajar, creaking as Laura pushed it open. Inside, a young girl sat on the hospital bed, her legs dangling over the edge. She looked no older than 10, her pale face framed by long dark hair. "Are you okay?" Laura asked, stepping closer. The girl lifted her head, her eyes wide with terror. "They're coming," she whispered. "Who's coming?" Laura asked, but before the girl could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. The girl pointed to the corner. "They're here." Laura turned, her flashlight beam landing on a shadow. A tall, humanoid figure with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The shadow moved, its limbs unnaturally long, its body jerking as if it were struggling to stay upright. Laura grabbed the girl's hand. "We need to leave. Now." As they ran down the hall, Laura could hear them. The shadows, their distorted whispers growing louder. "They shouldn't have survived. They all burn." The emergency lights flickered wildly, plunging the hallway into intermittent darkness. When they reached the steel doors, they found them shut tight. No amount of pulling or pounding would budge them. The girl tugged at Laura's sleeve. "There's another way out. Through the morgue." Laura hesitated but realized they had no choice. The morgue was even colder than the West Wing, the air so frigid it stung Laura's lungs. Rows of steel drawers lined the walls, some of them slightly ajar. The girl led her to a small, unmarked door at the back of the room. "This leads outside," she whispered. But as Laura reached for the handle, the lights flickered, and the shadows reappeared. They poured through the walls, their forms twisting and merging into a mass of darkness. "You can't leave," the shadows hissed. "You belong to us now." Laura shielded the girl, her mind racing. "What do you want?" she shouted. The shadows paused, and one stepped forward. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers. "Justice," it rasped. In a flash, images flooded Laura's mind. Patients screaming for help as fire consumed the ward. A nurse locking the doors to contain the flames. And then Laura saw herself, her younger self, standing outside the West Wing, watching the chaos unfold. She hadn't caused the fire, but she hadn't tried to save anyone, either. Fear had paralyzed her, and she had run. Tears streamed down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." The shadows loomed closer. "You left us to die," one whispered. Laura nodded, her voice trembling. "I did. And I've regretted it every day since." The shadows hesitated, their forms flickering. The girl stepped forward, holding Laura's hand. "She's sorry. Let her go." The shadows receded, their whispers fading. Laura woke up in the hospital lobby, the storm still raging outside. The steel doors to the West Wing were once again locked, and there was no sign of the girl. She never told anyone what happened that night, but she knew the West Wing wasn't empty. It never would be. Story number 4. The Midnight Procedure. St. Eliza's Medical Center stood at the edge of a dense forest, an aging hospital with a reputation for handling unusual cases. Its night shifts were known to be quiet, almost too quiet, and its labyrinthine halls felt as though they held secrets of their own. Dr. Adrian Hall, a young and ambitious surgeon, was covering his first overnight shift. The ER had been slow, with only a few minor cases. By midnight, the staff had thinned to a skeleton crew, leaving Adrian, a nurse named Lisa, and a janitor in the sprawling building. As Adrian sipped stale coffee in the break room, the intercom crackled to life. "Dr. Hall to operating room 4. Emergency case." Adrian frowned. Or 4 hadn't been used in years. It was part of the hospital's oldest wing, abandoned due to asbestos concerns. Lisa appeared at the door, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" "It's probably a glitch," Adrian replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Lisa hesitated. "Should we check it out?" Adrian nodded. Grabbing his flashlight, he led the way toward the darkened corridor that housed or 4. The hallway leading to the old operating rooms was unnervingly silent. The air felt heavier here, carrying a faint metallic tang. When they reached or 4, Adrian stopped. The door was ajar, light spilling out into the hallway. "That's impossible," Lisa whispered. "The power's been cut in this wing for years." Adrian pushed the door open, his flashlight revealing a fully lit operating room. The stainless steel instruments were laid out meticulously on the surgical tray, gleaming under the overhead lights. In the center of the room, a figure lay on the operating table, draped in a white sheet. Adrian's pulse quickened. "Is this a prank?" Lisa shook her head, backing toward the door. "We need to leave." The intercom crackled again. "Dr. Hall, prepare for surgery." Adrian stepped closer to the table, his curiosity overpowering his fear. With trembling hands, he pulled back the sheet. The patient was a middle-aged man, his face pale and waxy. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and his eyes were half open, staring at the ceiling. Adrian checked the man's wrist for a pulse. It was faint but steady. "He's alive," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa shook her head. "That's not possible. No one should be here." Before Adrian could respond, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The flashlight beam wavered as Adrian turned it toward Lisa. Her face was frozen in terror, her eyes locked on something behind him. "Adrian," she whispered, "we're not alone." A low, guttural sound filled the room, something between a growl and a whisper. Adrian spun around, his flashlight illuminating the corners of the room. Shadows moved unnaturally, curling and shifting against the walls. "Help him," A voice rasped, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. Adrian turned back to the patient. The man's lips were moving, though no sound came out. His hand twitched, reaching weakly toward Adrian. "Help me," the man finally whispered. Against his better judgment, Adrian decided to act. He donned a surgical mask and gloves, his hands shaking as he prepared the instruments. "What are you doing?" Lisa hissed. "I can't just leave him," Adrian said. "He's alive." The moment Adrian made the first incision, the room changed. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows seemed to press closer. Whispered voices filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Lisa grabbed Adrian's arm. "This isn't right. We need to stop." But Adrian couldn't stop. It was as if something unseen was guiding his hands, compelling him to continue. As Adrian worked, the patient's condition began to stabilize. The whispers grew softer, almost pleased. But then Adrian noticed something strange. Beneath the man's skin, something moved, something alive. He hesitated, staring at the incision. "What is that?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Adrian didn't answer. He reached for a pair of forceps, carefully extracting the object. It was a small, black, pulsating mass, like a tumor with veins that throbbed unnaturally. The moment it was removed, the patient's eyes snapped shut, and his body went still. The mass began to writhe in Adrian's hand, emitting a high-pitched screech. "Destroy it," Lisa urged. Adrian dropped the mass onto a metal tray, smashing it with the scalpel. The moment it was destroyed, the room went silent. When Adrian looked back at the operating table, the patient was gone. The instruments were rusted, the once bright lights now flickering weakly. "What just happened?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking. Adrian didn't have an answer. The intercom crackled one last time. "Procedure complete. Thank you, Dr. Hall." The lights in the hallway flickered back on, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Adrian and Lisa hurried back to the main wing, their minds reeling. When they checked the hospital's records the next day, there was no record of a patient matching the man's description, or 4 remained officially sealed. But Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital wasn't done with him. And late at night, when the halls were quiet, he could still hear the intercom crackle to life, calling him back to the silent depths of the hospital.